I think it's because of my Scandinavian heritage that I have always been a bit fascinated by stories of the Vikings. Recently I've been catching up on some older TV shows that are new to me. One called The Last Kingdom that features the Northmen or the Vikings the Danes as they come into England and fight with Alfred the Great. Now I'm in the midst of a show called Vikings. I think it's a History Channel show, and it also looks at the period a little bit before that as the Vikings were raiding into the places of England and France. One of the things that you see throughout the plots of these shows, and whether it's historically accurate or not, it certainly makes for good TV, is the idea of revenge. There is, say, a king that tries to take the life of someone, and then that someone kills the king instead, and then the king's son has to come to revenge his father. And then, right, these cycles of revenge go back and forth, these cycles of violence, where one is killed and then another needs to even the score. And so you see that there's a bit of scorekeeping in this cycle of violence, where one side feels that the score is not even and has to then bring more violence to even that score. Now, these stories are set in the 9th century, and it may seem like that is a long way back, and that we as people have somehow migrated away from that sort of revenge-based cycle of violence. But you don't have to look very far in our present day to see that we live in the exact same ways. Whether it's street gangs that fight back and forth to revenge previous wrongs that have been felt or incurred, or whether it's nations that throw missiles one way because an attack has come the other way. This week we remembered September 11th and all of the loss of life of that day. If another attack were to occur on our soil, or if our Navy ship in a port internationally somewhere is attacked, we would quickly hear calls for retribution. For political analysts might be saying that it needs to be proportional and that the response needs to be made so that people know that we can't be messed with. All of that is part of the same cycle of violence that has this idea of score keeping, right? To make sure that things are even and that we have had our way. But scorekeeping doesn't just stop in those sort of international political sorts of places. I would bet today that some of you are in marriages, that you're keeping score of little slights or what chores get done and don't get done, and that kind of can build up into places of tension. Some of you have aging parents and siblings, and there is some scorekeeping amongst the siblings about who is doing the most to help deal with those situations. And there's just the general grudges that we carry and keep score about in our particular ways in our culture. Sometimes we keep score literally because it's a game. If you think of professional sports, there's the scorekeeping of goals or points or touchdowns, whatever it is that's up on the scoreboard. But it doesn't stop with the literal score. Professional athletes compete with one another and keep score as to who has the biggest salary based on their perceived level of talent. And that financial scorekeeping is not unique to athletes. We have debts we keep score of and other ways of keeping track of dollars and cents in a scorekeeping kind of way. Now, we know that all of this scorekeeping is not always that healthy, and the reason I know that we know this is because we have created sometimes little kid sports leagues where we don't keep score. I coached soccer once in a league like that where the older kids played on a full-size soccer field, but the little kids, the littlest ones, played on these little tiny fields with little goals, no goalies, and then no scorekeeping. We're just out here to have fun and play the game. But guess who was keeping score? Those same little kids who couldn't play on the biggest soccer field could count. And at the end of the game, you might hear one of them say, "We won," right? Because they knew and they were keeping score. It's something we do as people. When Peter comes to Jesus and said, "How many times must I forgive?" he is doing some scorekeeping. He's keeping track of wrongs that someone has perpetrated against him, and he has maybe forgiven a couple of times, but he wants to know what that limit is, how often he has to do that. And I'm thinking that he thought 7 was just a whole bunch and says to Jesus, 7, is that enough? And he's expecting Jesus to say, "Oh, 7's too many, let's stop at 5. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus goes way beyond that and says 77 times, meaning you don't really get to stop forgiving if you're going to follow me. It's just part of what you do. And then what follows is a parable. And the parable starts by talking about this is a comparison to the kingdom of heaven, and it ends by saying we need to forgive our brothers and sisters, our siblings, from our hearts. And before unpacking this parable, I want to take a moment to pause and talk a little bit about how difficult forgiveness is and a framework for how we might think about it. Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mfo wrote a book called The Book of Forgiving. And in it, they use the experiences that they had as people of color in apartheid South Africa to lay out a path for healing, very much part of what they did with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And their fourfold path for forgiveness starts with telling your story. Those people that have been harmed need to be able to share in their own words the experiences that led them to this place of needing to forgive someone. The second part, having told your story, is to name the hurt. So amidst that story, to be able to say, this is what pain that has caused me. The third part then is to offer forgiveness for that pain. And the fourth part is to either renew or to release the relationship. This is an important bit because there are, for example, women who are abused by their spouses, and they may get to a place of forgiveness, but the abuse would continue, right? You have to release that relationship and get away from that abuse, and you can still have forgiveness, but the point is that sometimes renewing the relationship isn't always possible. So tell the story, name the hurt, offer the forgiveness, and then do the part of renewing or releasing the relationship. Now, some of these storytelling things might be to the person that has done the harm, and some of the forgiveness might be offered or even asked for by those people, but that's not necessarily a requirement. The story can be told to others, and the forgiveness offered even if it isn't accepted or asked for. So taking that framework, then, I think we can come at this parable that has two sort of parallel stories going on. The first one is this king who he wants to reconcile his accounts with the slaves. And so he brings the slave forward and says, you owe me 10,000 talents. And he says, I can't pay you right now, but just give me time. And then the king says, well, I'm going to sell you and your wife and your children and all your stuff so that you can pay part of that debt. And the slave pleads, and then the master relents. And if you take that framework, right, the king is telling a story of you owe me money, and we don't get all of the details, but built into that is the hurt that you haven't paid me back, and that has had a financial cost for me. He then ultimately offers forgiveness, and you get a sense that that relationship is renewed. But at the same time, the slave pleads, right? He says, please give me time. And there is in that pleas its own story that says, I'm a slave, right? Part of the reason I'm indebted to you is because you have enslaved me. And there's a plea for mercy in that. And so that fourfold path of telling the story and naming the hurt and then offering forgiveness, you can see it at work to a place where it seems like that relationship then has been renewed and that this great debt has been forgiven. Now that same slave then goes out and follows that same path. He tells another slave, you owe me. It's quite a bit less, but you owe me, and it's been a pain for me. And then he stops, right? He doesn't get to that step of offering forgiveness, and the relationship isn't renewed. In fact, it is taken to a different place of tension. He breaks that cycle of forgiveness and goes back to the same scorekeeping sort of cycles of violence that we live in all the time. Now, it's important, I think, in the story to look at who is doing what. The king offers ultimately grace. The slave that is given that grace doesn't. What he introduces is violence. When the first slave comes before the king is not violent. He brings him before him and just makes this accounting. But that slave then goes and grabs the other by the throat and throws him in jail. So in this parable, we have a king who is bringing grace and bringing opportunities for newness and renewal and new life. And we have a slave who is bringing violence and retribution and scorekeeping in a real way back into the situation. And it's harmful to relationships as it goes. You can imagine then that slave is keeping score in a certain way. He wants his debts forgiven, but isn't willing to forgive the others. He wants his story to be heard, his pain to be heard, but isn't willing to hear the story and the pain of others. He wants his relationship with his king renewed, but isn't willing to renew that relationship with the one that is with him. And we can then look around at the ways that we live and understand that as Easter people, God has already given us this gift of new life, this gift of forgiveness, and how do we live with it? Are we willing to forgive others, or do we just want to receive the forgiveness ourselves? You can look at the great division that we have among us and see that so many people want to be heard. We want, and whether we're telling that story to a neighbor or posting something on Facebook or however it is we're doing it, we want our story to be heard. But then someone has to listen to it. And do we really want to listen to the stories of others, or do we just want to get our opinion out there? When you think about your own relationships in your life, and you're maybe keeping score about grudges and hurts that have come your way, how often do we want to be the one who is forgiven? Do we want to share our hurt and get it out in the world and have our part of the relationship renewed and ourselves forgiven, but then we won't do the same for others? It happens in small scale in our own lives, and it happens in the ways that we participate as a culture. When you think about all of the protests that are happening right now and all of the tension in our culture and all the politicization of the virus that we have and all of the rest of it, where in there is anybody listening and offering forgiveness and hearing the hurts of others and trying to seek places of reconciliation and new relationship? You don't see that much, right? It's all about us trying to get our voice heard and get things the way that we want it. Very much the way that first slave does. He receives the grace and is willing to do that, but isn't willing to share it. Now, there's an important part for me of this parable that is easy for us to miss because we operate in a different denomination of currency, right? We operate in dollars and cents, not talents and denarii. I don't know about you, but the math of what a talent is hasn't always been something that's readily apparent to me. So when I hear this parable, it sounds like $10,000 and a few $100s. But that completely misses the scope of what is happening in this story. When you hear this parable and they say 10,000 talents, you have to understand that a talent is 15 years' wages for a laborer, and a denarii is 1 day's wages for a laborer. So I did some math this week and figured, let's say a laborer makes $8 an hour as just a low example to work with. 3 denarii would end up being about $6,400. That's not a small debt that a slave might owe another slave. But if you then turn around and do the math on talents, 15 years wages for a laborer is 1 talent. So 10,000 talents is 150,000 years wages for a laborer. And if you take $8 an hour and 8 hours a day and say work 48 weeks a year, maybe give somebody 4 weeks of vacation. If you multiply that out, 10,000 talents is 2.3 billion with a B dollars. So what you have in this parable is a slave who owes $2.3 billion to the king and a slave that owes him 6,400. These things are not even on the same scorecard in any way. The grace that is offered from this king to the first slave is ridiculous. It is mind-blowing. When he threatens to sell the slave and his wife and his children, this wouldn't even put any kind of a dent into the debt that he is owed by this slave. And that slave would turn around then and not even forgive this little tiny debt, like not even registering compared to the size of the other, is where the ridiculousness of this parable comes in. That Peter would say, I'm going to keep score about forgiveness, and Jesus then turns around and says, you can't keep score. The gift that God gives you, you can't keep up with it. There is no way. The point being that when Jesus comes into this world as God and we end up putting him on the cross, that in that new life of resurrection, the forgiveness is an amount of grace that is beyond our comprehension. It is so far beyond us to understand or to grasp, and it is impossible for us to pay. We then have this gift of life that comes to us first, which is what happens in the parable. That slave gets that gift of life first and then is sent out in this new way. And he misses that, right? What we are to do is to understand that this gift of forgiveness and grace that we have given us is so great that it is beyond our ability to earn, but it is not beyond our ability to share. We have been given this great gift of life and this gift of forgiveness, and we are then sent out into the world knowing that there's nothing we could possibly do to qualify for, to earn, or to keep score with God in that space of grace. And then that being the case, we ought then take that enormous amount of grace we have been given, more than we can quantify or imagine, and share it with the people around us. And that's where Desmond Tutu and his daughter give us this framework to live into a new way of being, to break those cycles of violence and revenge, whether it's in those personal relationships we have or in our culture and national relationships. And we do that by telling the story, by naming our hurts, by then offering forgiveness, and then living into renewed or released relationships. But the other side of that is the mercy. It's the listening to stories. It's the listening to the hurts, especially the hurts that come from people on the fringes, like in this story, the slaves. In our day, people who live in poverty, people who live oppressed, people who experience violence every day. We should listen to their stories and listen to their hurts, and we just might find that there are places where we need forgiveness. And we can ask for it or accept it when it is offered, and then seek renewal in relationships. Understanding that sometimes that's not possible, but trying to live into that gift of reconciliation that God gives us. This parable ends with what sounds like a terrible threat. The king says, because of what you've done, you're going to be tortured until you can pay it all back. I don't think God is going to be in the business of torturing us for not forgiving, but rather, I think what actually happens is we create the torture ourselves. Sometimes we carry grudges, or we carry around with us the pain of forgiveness that we have not offered, and that eats at us. It tortures us. And the cycles of violence that we live into when we can't forgive are torture for us and for our neighbors. We are already torturing ourselves by not being able to forgive. What this parable is telling us is that God has given us a gift of grace and forgiveness to live into, so that we can stop torturing ourselves and begin to live into that grace of God that is right there, right near us each and every day. Forgiveness is hard, but it is not impossible. And it is a path that takes practice and practice and practice. And just as the Tutus invite us into that, so does Jesus, so that we might have life and have it abundantly in the ridiculous amount of grace that the King offers in this story and that God offers us each and every day. Amen.